Welcome back to Stream 2 this morning. I hope you've had time to grab a quick cuppa and a bicky. Lunch is not too far away though if you haven't. I'd like to introduce our next speaker in this section of the conference. It's Paul McDonald. Now, Paul is the CEO of Southern Queensland Landscapes. He's passionate about our First Nations people and is driven to connect them with NRM outcomes and also to learn from their cultural land practices. Paul has been involved with government agencies and NRM bodies for most of his professional career, and it's fantastic to have him joining us today. Please welcome Paul McDonald.
Thanks, Nicole. A couple of things to clarify before I commence. One of them is I'm not an Aboriginal person. I'm from over in the southeast of Queensland originally, and these days look after Southern Queensland Landscapes, which runs from the escarpment near Toowoomba down to the border, out to the Grey Range, and covers the Murray-Darling Basin in Queensland, plus the Bulloo catchment. So it's a good slice of dirt, and it's just below this. Now, rangelands commence around about Mitchell and St George and range out to the points west. So we have 28 nations in our area which we work with, and those 28 nations have varying cultures. Some are maternal, some are paternal. Either way, we certainly pay our respects to those elders. They hold the memories, traditions, culture, science and knowledge, and more importantly these days, the hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples across our nation. So importantly, they've, and I've checked with them about this presentation, they've okayed it. It doesn't contain any particular story, it just explains how our Aboriginal friends see the world of water and really the. So I'll just touch on some of the cultural aspects. I'll then talk about the science, law and knowledge that I'm aware of. My understanding of how our nations approach their rivers and their springs, and then perhaps some ways forward to think about. And at the end of the presentation, if people are interested, I've left a bunch of resources that people might want to check. So the reason why I start with culture is First Nations cultures are very different to European and Western cultures. There's lots of reasons for that, so if you'll bear with me for a couple of minutes, I'll do my best to explain those differences and why they matter. So overall, our First Nations don't see the world the way we do, and it underpins a lot of the differences that we have. In an Aboriginal culture, is a prime directive that all must survive, and all means all, not just humans. And so that drives a lot of how they see their world and how they relate with their world. Whereas our culture in the Western European world is one of survival of the fittest. It's a strong driver, wealth, all those sorts of things that drive us to get ahead, etc. It's not so much community one, although community, whilst it means a lot to us, it's not the prime directive. So just a couple of things about the differences. In traditional cultures, community is the foremost of all values. It goes back to forever that the way to survive in any sort of hostile environment is to act together as community. For First Nations, future tense is dominant, but interestingly, time is of less importance. Past, present and future are all mixed up in Aboriginal cultures. The world is understood mythically, goals are met with patience, ownership is often communal. Gifts are regarded as social glue in their nations, and work is often motivated by the need of all. Whereas mainstream Western culture talks about individualism, present is what's important, the world is understood scientifically, goals are met with aggressive effort. We all have goals and we act towards them. Ownership is about reward for hard work. Gifts are regarded as holiday issues, and work is motivated by ambition. So there's a lot of differences in how each of them runs. And in terms of personal things. Old people are of great value in Aboriginal and traditional cultures. Not all old people are elders, but most elders are old people, and they are not chiefs or bosses or tribal leaders. They are teachers. Big misconception. So in those terms, aging is a source to wisdom, whereas in mainstream Western, it's aging is a decay and loss. As we get older, you need to be taken care of and all those sorts of things. And this varies. Some nations, eye contact is not a problem, but if you're more on the western side of Australia, then eye contact is thought of as a bit assertive and is usually avoided. Whereas if I don't meet you with eye contact regularly, particularly in Western culture, you'll wonder if I'm interested. Are acceptable anywhere in a traditional culture, whereas in our culture, silence just wastes time. Why don't you get on with it? Assertiveness is non-communal, whereas assertiveness in Western culture is a basic social skill, and so on. So I guess those differences in culture, it's important to understand because they start to help us begin to understand why we view things differently. You may notice in traditional culture, there's nodding from Aboriginal people. All that is saying, I understand. It doesn't mean I agree with you, which is the common thought in Western culture. The handshake, the old here's your wet fish thing, it's just a signalling of no threat because, you know, how your body language and how you work in traditional culture can be seen as a threat. Whereas in our culture in the West, we want to shake hands firmly and look you in the eye and all that. So, and so on. There's those sorts of things. I won't labour the point at this stage. So, why is it important that we consider it? Variously, depending on what you read, and particularly up in the northwest of Australia, we've got rock solid evidence that our first people have been here for 65,000 years. Around this area, the evidence seems to indicate somewhere around 45 to 50,000 years. That's a long time to watch landscape and understand it. We've been here in Australia for 250 years, and in this country for really not even 200 years. So we might not know as much as we think. The recent State of the Environment reports continue to show declines, and most of the presentations have talked about that. It is what it is, but it's a good reason for us to start listening to people who had it running for 60,000 years. The evidence of rainfall and runoff since measurements started, particularly in our region, shows a rapid decline, and I think there's been a few people showing graphs which shows that that's right across the rangelands, and it's a trend. So perhaps we need to listen a bit. So when I talk about the land and water story, I guess I'm talking about it from a very different perspective the more I begin to understand how Aboriginal people see it. It's an totally interconnected whole. Management that we've heard a few things about goes some of the way toward it, but there's a richer story that I've learned about all this stuff. Some of you will have heard of the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the desire by nations to want constitutional recognition. It seems to be something that's a bridge too far for our Western system of politics, which is fine. But I guess the key thing about that statement is it talks about creation and how Aboriginal culture has been running and what that means to them. It's an ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born and so on. So this link is really strong, and it's a link that makes them a part of, not in addition to, as Western culture does. We talk about controlling or management. They talk about living with and understanding. So to understand things, because of my background, I need to understand the knowledge systems and I need to understand how the knowledge processes work. So with Aboriginal knowledge, their bodies have integrated holistic social and ecological knowledge practices and beliefs pertaining to the relationships of living beings, including people. which is an important concept, with one another and with their environments. It's grounded in territory, is highly diverse, and is continuously evolving through the interaction of experiences, innovations, and various types of written, oral, visual, tacit, gendered, practical, and scientific knowledge. It can provide information methods, theory, and practice for sustainable ecosystems management. And many Aboriginal knowledge systems are empirically tested, applied, contested, and validated through many different means. It's something that, as a Western culture, we haven't noticed, but those knowledge systems are tested widely. And there is a level of knowledge of country that exists still in Aboriginal culture, not in the eastern side of Australia, but it does still exist in Australia. And it's a really valuable set of knowledge which is at risk of dying along with the knowledge holders. So it is a much more complex system than I ever thought. So a little bit about law and how it works in culture. A good friend of mine who has been with the Australian level knowledge holders tells me that the land is law. And it took me a little while to understand that, but essentially it's saying the way you exist well in a landscape is to really learn it, understand it, and let it help you and you help it. That's not to say we should go back to pre-European, because it's just not possible. In those days, before Western culture came into this country, there were only about 3 million people that were fed without any trouble from this land, even in the worst of times. That's now not the case. We feed 72 million, according to the latest information on our ag production. So we can't go back. What we can do is learn together. So the way in which those knowledge and understandings of nation and how land works has been put into ceremonies, songs, dances, artifacts, many things. There's one nation not too far south of here, for example, that has a message stick that has been dated at 23,000 years old. There's more than just the Borona fish traps. There are many other fish traps I'm aware of now that are around the 30 to 40,000 years old. Another nation a little bit southeast of here has an oven, one of the first ovens for baking bread, 30,000 years old. It's been dated at. So these are very long, rich knowledge systems. Importantly, it is intellectual property in our Western thinking. And many nations have had their knowledge taken and then patents put around it, and then they can't practice culture. These things are very important when you start to understand the impacts of how a Western system works and how the Aborigines think. So perhaps some ways of understanding how Aboriginal folk learn before we start on the water story. There has been a lot of work done by a number of good people in Western society, and one of the best is what Queensland has done with its curriculum assessment. And it talks about the ways of learning around story sharing, narratives, learning maps, and learning maps are quite fascinating. Some great books that can help you understand that. Hands-on reflective techniques, symbols and images, message sticks contain them, for example. Land-based learning, a lot of our stock routes are actually the old walking trails and in some cases songlines for nations. And the stories are written in those walking tracks. And the stories are usually of some sort of animal. And I'll get to why that matters in a minute. Synergistic logic, interdisciplinary thinking, they deconstruct and reconstruct things, and in fact how they learn from a single story to get multiple messages is around that deconstruct and reconstruct job. And then one of the first things you'll notice if you watch Aborigines say g'day to each other, the first thing they say is, who's your mum? That's the way they work. It's all about community. They can tell you their aunt, their uncles, they can tell you all of their networks, they can tell you who's married to who and who isn't. So this levels of knowledge thing, I didn't understand it until it was explained to me this way. I'm a bit slow. So the first level is of a story. It's about a magpie and an eagle or something. The first level of the story is to explain the basic concepts of animal behaviour, a little bit about what we've labelled as a culture dreaming. It's about keeping our kids safe and our kids learning. You know, you don't go swimming in a lake that has a croc in it. You don't go mucking around with eastern browns or things like that. You know, there's a whole bunch of simple things in story that is a lot of fun. It's exciting, but it's teaching the young people law. The second level, that's about the relationship between people and things. It's about helping people understand that a landscape is a complex set of interdependencies. If you take out that little moth that particularly has a way of dealing with that particular flower, that it gets eaten by that particular bird, that then goes on to do these other things in the landscape, then you've wiped out a service that's being provided by that little moth. So they're the sort of things that that second level has in it. The third level is what we would call traditional ecological knowledge, and it's teaching people how to be good people, how to look after their part of the landscape. It would be what in our culture we would value most highly from Aboriginal nations. It's the stuff that we would call science, as well as a number of other things. And Aboriginal science is a lot more advanced than I ever knew anyway. Then there's this fourth level. I'm told by people that there are no fourth level knowledge holders on the eastern side of Australia anymore. There are reasons for that, they tell me, but nonetheless, the fourth level does exist. And as I say, one of my mates who has been with fourth level people has witnessed things and told me what has gone on. But it's your psychic level, if you like. It's the dreaming. It's knowing things without seeing them. It's invoking lightning. One of the nations south of here are actually called the Rainmakers. One of the old aunties tells me as a kid she used to have to run when her ancestors were creating storms. I don't know whether these things are true, but I take it on face value. So that's the fourth level. So they're the levels of knowledge. So we in our culture talk a lot about the dreaming. So essentially what the dreaming's about is everyone and everything was kind of created equal, and that the difference between then and now is those that obeyed the law that was passed down by creation, they became human. Those that didn't obey the law stayed as animals. And that's why this system of totem comes about, is that they are brother in a true sense. And so, interestingly, a lot of our understanding comes from our Western thinking, but in Aboriginal society, totem is the echidna. And there are a whole bunch of rules to look after the echidna, because that's your brother or your sister. So I don't want to labour on it, but you know, there's a lot of stuff around that. So when we come to water, if you can accept those things about knowledge systems, about deep understandings, about how a whole landscape is carved up into bits that everyone in a nation is responsible for, you begin to think about water a little bit differently. And as you can read on that quote, the creeks and gullies are our arteries and water is our blood. And without that blood, which is the water, we are stuffed. We want a lot of them protected, not just the rivers. And that's referring not just to rivers in this sense. It was also talking about springs and spring complexes, which I'll talk with in a minute. So this is a direct quote from a number of traditional knowledge people from the southwest of Queensland. They were brought together in 2012 by one of our company's predecessors, Southwest NRM. Importantly, it reinforces how important water is, and if if you take that into our current situation and look at what we've been doing with our natural resource management plan in our region, the major issues that come up right across our region is water. There's water, looking after country, getting country healthy, those sorts of things. So it's a funny thing, but we all want the same thing. So the key types of water, and these are listed from that same gathering of those traditional people. It's not a lot different to how we would assess how water is classified. So you've got your springs, waterholes, lakes, rivers, wetlands, bores, Artesian Basin, underground rivers, and so on. So you can read all that. Importantly, in Australia, there are the saltwater people, river people, and desert people, and they are not the same. They see the world differently because their ecosystems and their landscapes are different. They behave differently. And around here, we would sort of be on the cusp of some of the desert people, but mostly we've got the river people. We've got an extremely good river in the Thompson and Cooper in this part of the country and all the complexes around it. So the desert channels is still river people. But once you get west of there, you start turning to desert people, and it's a different setup. So water is the heart of creation. You know, the first thing that creation made was the river. And there's plenty of story in all of the nations across the country about that. What we've done is we've separated water from land and from vegetation and from animals and people, and we've put it as a commodity. So for Aboriginal people, they just don't get it. They don't get what we've done. It just doesn't make any sense. So that's the first thing to understand. Second thing is when country is sick, Aborigines are sick. And there's a fair chance that the closing the gap problem is not one of health, it's one of country, but I'll leave that for Aboriginal people to talk more about. So a lot of people describe the way our country's been in the last few years as like visiting a sick uncle or auntie with cancer. So it's not good. In Aboriginal culture, water is not just part of the natural, it's part of spiritual environment of things. Water has deep meaning. So with groundwater, and Malcolm Mogridge, he's an associate professor at Canberra Uni, has done a lot of work. He's a traditional man from country in northwest New South Wales. He's done a lot of work on trying to bridge the gap. And the beauty about what he's done is he can connect his nation's story with Western science in a true sense. So if you think about our Great Artesian Basin, which is the lifeblood of this country, essentially, well, Aboriginal people owed their existence to it. They knew how it worked. They knew how it operated. They knew how to use it in the landscape. They were very careful to make sure it was never depleted in any way. Otherwise, there is no life for them. So from their point of view, it's not a lot different to how we see it. They see the soaks, the wells, the springs, the mound springs, the bores, and the hanging swamps. They see all of those things, and it is part of how they relate with their country in each of those contexts. There are stories, wide stories around each of those things. It's no accident along our song lines or along the stock routes and walking trails. But about every 30 k's, there is a native well of some sort. There is a water source. And the reason is because 30 k's is a day's walk. So none of it's rocket science. Very practical. And around that waterhole, they would have put plenty of food trees, medicine trees, and other things. And that was built up over millennium. So it was all well put together. Unfortunately, when we arrived as a culture, we didn't recognise any of it. So if we didn't have groundwater, you wouldn't have had habitation in the West. It's as simple as that. Whilst the rivers would have sustained some life, a lot of them require that spring-fed nation of it. So a lot of law in particularly the river country and the desert country is about taking care of water because the water takes care of the landscape takes care of you and me. That's essentially the logic of it, and that each part of that complex system was carefully managed and spread throughout the nation. So what do we do about all this? It's one of those things that you can have all the theory on earth, but in the end we just need some next steps. And luckily, as I mentioned, we work with 28 nations. There's a good half of them that don't want to be angry anymore. They just want to take next steps with us and walk together into a decent future. So, oops, apologies. So I'll drop that one. Because the Australian government has ratified a number of things, and because we have been learning, and because the system is slowly responding, we do now have a system of recognising cultural water. It's got a long way to go. The Murray-Darling Basin has been the pioneer of it. It's recognised in our Queensland water plans. However, none of it's got into Aboriginal hands yet. There was $40 million in the Murray-Darling Basin Authority program for cultural water. Not a cent still arrived for Aboriginal people. They're patient, but nonetheless, at least there's some recognition. So the Aboriginal people I am now working with are very keen to walk together. They have a great understanding that as the relationship gets stronger with them, that they're willing to share story. You'll notice I haven't told any stories because they're not mine, but I have been told stories, and I know that knowledge is rock solid, and I know that if we can develop some trusting relationships with our nations, we'll start then libraries, people like Malcolm Mogridge do their best to write some of them down, but most of them are in oral knowledge systems. As I mentioned, there's layers. There's the nation level, then there's the group of nation level or language group level of knowledge, and then there's the whole of Australian knowledge. And if we are open in our hearts, we should be able to learn a little bit about that from those same Australian level knowledge holders. So in the end, the critical bit is understanding and learning what respect is. And it's not what I thought it was. Respect is more about, in our culture, we'd probably call it saying being vulnerable, or in their culture, it's letting me see the real you. And when someone does a welcome to country, that's essentially what they're doing, is they're welcoming us to them. It's not just to their country or, the traditional greeting that we all do to acknowledge country. It's actually welcoming you to their place. It's like you coming into a house. So that respect, I think, is a key thing as a next step. We've got to learn how to practice respect with each other. Then we start to unlock these knowledges, and then we start to do some things that I suspect we all know in our gut we need to be doing to learn how to better holistically look after country. I'll leave it at that.